Thank you, colleagues. So we will now start meeting number 16 of our study on electoral reform, and we have three witnesses here with us this afternoon. We have Professor Matthew Harrington, Professor Thomas Axworthy, and Professor Pippa Norris, who is joining us by video conference. And I would like to take a couple of minutes to simply briefly introduce our witnesses. Professor Matthew Harrington is president of the Common Law Program Committee of Université de Montréal's law faculty. He teaches U.S. constitutional law and property and trust law, and has published works on the economic origins of law, among other topics. Dr. Harrington recently co-hosted a conference at the Université de Montréal, funded in part by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, about the relationship between the Supreme Court of Canada and the common law. Thomas Axworthy is a renowned public servant, political strategist, writer, and professor. He is most well known for his role as senior policy advisor and principal secretary to Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau from 1981 to 1984, during which time he played a key role in repatriating the Constitution and introducing the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. He has made a lifetime's work of notable contributions to Canadian society and continues to facilitate international action and cooperation as member and, more recently, Secretary General of the Interaction Council. In 2009, Professor Axworthy chaired the Advisory Task Force on Democracy Promotion for the Minister of Democratic Reform of the day. He was also the chair and executive director of the Center for the Study of Democracy at Queen's University. In 2012, Professor Axworthy was awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for his contributions to Canadian public policy. Professor Pippa Norris is the Maguire Lecturer in Comparative Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow, and a Professor of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney, Australia. Dr. Norris is also the Director of the Electoral Integrity Project, based at the University of Sydney and supported by the Australian Research Council and other foundations. Dr. Norris is one of the world's most cited political scientists. Her research focuses on public opinion and elections, democratic institutions and cultures, political communications in countries around the world, and gender and politics. She was recently awarded the Brown Medal for Democracy. Other accolades include the Karl Deutsch Award and the Johann Skeet Award and the Kathleen Fitzpatrick Australian Laureate Fellowship. Dr. Norris's most recent books are Contentious Elections, Why Elections Fail, and Checkbook Elections, Political Finance in Comparative Perspective. So we shall start. Pardon me? Okay. I think Mr. Reid was just expressing awe and how much he's impressed by our panel. So we'll start with, if it's okay, we'll start with Dr. Norris, please, for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk again with the Canadian Parliament about this really important topic. And there are really three issues which I think are worth highlighting. Number one, what are the key options on the table, which are partly about electoral systems, but also a lot of details. Should there be a referendum, for example, to introduce any sort of reform? Should there be different types of mandatory voting and so on? Number two is the question about why reform the current system. And of course, the classic issue is if it ain't broken. So what's the problem which we're trying to address in which a different change might actually work? And then thirdly, what might be the consequences if we adopt one system or another? What would it do? So if we just take the first issue, in terms of the electoral system, as your committee has debated in the past, essentially there are the core four main options which are on the table. One is to obviously maintain the status quo, first past the post, majoritarian plurality systems, which have certain virtues and which are very familiar and which are used in a number of countries, obviously including the United Kingdom as a result of the failure to reform, as well as the United States. The preferential vote, I know, has been an issue which has been under question, in which there's ranked choice, like in the Australian House of Representatives. The most popular option, which has been going on with many reforms in many countries, is the New Zealand option of the mixed member proportional. where it's like the German system, one vote for the PR system, one vote for the single member. It's kind of a mix of both majoritarian and proportional representation, but often what's critical are a lot of the details, like how many seats are allocated to one or the other. Are they actually counterbalancing, or are they separate votes? And then lastly, pure PR, proportional representation, which is not really on the table, although clearly that's used in many, many countries around the world, producing a pure proportionality of votes to seats. So the question then is, how are these really being thought through? And what's worth emphasising is that the devil is often in the detail in all of these designs. And therefore you really do need to look in some question, not just at the broad electoral law and systems, but basic procedures. And things like, I know are being debated, if we're going to introduce any sort of reform, does there need to be a public mandate for it? Going through a referendum process is one issue which the committee is considering. And then whether there should, for example, be compulsory voting to address questions like low or declining turnout. And then other issues also can be there for electoral procedures. And again, I know with the Fair Votes Act in Canada, there have been questions about those as well, to make sure there's both inclusive balloting, and everybody who has a voting right can exercise that. They're not discriminated against, but at the same time they're secure balloting, so there's no question of impersonation or double voting. So these are the kind of options which I know you've been considering. Why reform the current electoral system? This is the basic issue. So clearly the Prime Minister committed Canada to think about this and for the Parliament to put this onto the agenda, with the commitment that 2015 will be the last federal election which is conducted under first past the post. But again, I don't think that the process has really necessarily thought through what the problems might be in some of the early debates, certainly. I looked, for example, at the Democratic Institutions Minister, and I looked at the points of 8 different issues that were mentioned, and some of them you can clearly see are a critical issue. Some of them might be less so. But also the things which are being mentioned, for example, legitimacy, efficacy, diversity, simplicity, user-friendliness, you can't get all of these values in any one particular option. They're all trade-off values. So think about issues like first past the post is actually very simple for the voters to make their choice. They have to basically mark one candidate, one party on the ballot, and then the parliamentary system takes care of the rest. If you have a double choice, for example, the mixed member system, that gives people more options, but they also had to become familiar with, for example, a wide range of candidates or different issues on the ballot. They have to think about their strategic choices as well. For example, if they support a minor party, does it make sense to vote for that party in both parts of the ballot? Maybe under first past the post, strategically they vote for a major party under the single member district, but under the proportional representation they might vote for a minor party. So essentially what you've got is different choices, and no one system is going to meet all the points that the Democratic Institutions Minister set out. If, for example, you want to emphasise the issues of fairness, for example, to minor parties, then a more proportional system is clearly going to get you there, because that is much more likely to bring in more minor parties with a lower vote threshold in order to win seats. On the other hand, if you want to go for local accountability, then you'll go for the first past the post, because the single member district is where voters can vote for the candidate, not just for the party list. So there's complex issues of the values and issues about what the consequences might be and what the problems are at the heart of the elections which are held in Canada. And what can we say about, lastly, the consequences, to come to the issue which I'm sure is really of most challenge to establish? It's very difficult to go from one system to another. So you can certainly look at other countries, as I know you have. You've looked at Ireland, you've looked at Australia, and you've looked at Britain, and you can say, what are the ways in which their electoral systems work? But again, it's often a bundle of choices you have. And so the way that, for example, the Australian system works, with its mandatory voting and with its different systems for the Senate and for the House, won't necessarily translate into how Canada those same things would work. But what we can say is, let's make some projections on how each of these different options, the basic electoral systems, might work, first in terms of seats, and then in terms of things like gender equality or diversity, and then in things such as proportionality. So just in terms of seats, what are the basic projections? Well, we can take the last election results under the current system in the 2015, and we can just make a simple projection if it was under a system of any of the other alternatives we mentioned, what might be the consequences. Well, quite simply, if we look under preferential voting, which is, for example, the system which we use in Australia for the House of Representatives, quite simply this would reduce, at present, the number of seats which are allocated to the Liberals. They would go down substantially, just on the same share of the vote, from, for example, 54 to 30% of the seats. The other parties would also change quite a lot, and we can see again that other parties would potentially benefit from this, but some parties would stay much the same. If we go right the way through to a mixed member system, the consequences for seats would depend on how you have a balance. You might have half and half, or you might say only a proportion of the parliamentary seats go through the proportional system, the rest go through first past the post. But under that system, you'll probably do a greater share of seats for the minor parties who can get in through the proportional vote, even if they can't currently get in through the single-member districts. But that also depends on their geographic dispersion. So if you're clustered, like in Quebec, then obviously you can still get in through the first-past-the-post system of single-member districts. But if your vote is dispersed across different ridings and different regions, then a minor party is likely to do better under any proportional or mixed-member system. So obviously that's a key thing to consider. And we have to say that the level of proportionality is another question. And that's about the share of votes to seats. That's often what people think about when they think about a fair system. And again, it's likely that a more proportional system is going to get a greater degree of proportionality. But is this basically a problem in the Canadian system? And when I run the analysis, I've looked at some statistics at the level of proportionality in the Canadian elections, right back from 1945 to date. You don't find that that's actually gone up a lot or gone down a lot in recent years. So again, is this a matter of concern? This is up to your judgment. And finally, what about public opinion? Do they have any preferences for any of these types of electoral systems? Well, public opinion on these sorts of issues is often soft, meaning that it's a technical issue. The public in many countries hasn't often thought about these systems, and often it's only if they come to a real referendum that they actually think about those choices. But nevertheless, when we look at some of the public opinion polls in Canada which have been put forward on this issue, the preferences still seem to be to favour the current status quo, not to change. That's not surprising when people are asked in various studies. Of the other systems, there seems to be a slight preference for the mixed member proportional versus either pure PR or ranked preference voting. But basically, public opinion is not well formed on this issue. If you went to a referendum, the ideal thing would probably be to go to a referendum like in New Zealand, where you have first the question, does the public feel there should be reform? If yes, what should be the type of system which is chosen? And my bottom money is probably going to be that you'll probably go towards the mixed member system if any of the other choices were being preferred, because that system has both the virtues of single-member districts, which is familiar, and proportional representation, which gives a better chance to minor parties and to women and other forms of diversity. But it's still probably likely that, as in the UK, when there was a referendum on this issue, overwhelmingly the public is not necessarily in favour of radical reform unless the problems are really put more clearly to the Canadian public.
Thank you
very much for the opportunity to talk, and I hope
that was very
that was useful.
And there'll be many questions for certain. We'll go now to Professor Axworthy, please, for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'll make 5 points in the presentation, so a couple of minutes on each of them. And though I'm happy to provide the speaking notes later to the committee if they want more details. And some of the points have already been made by Pippa Norris, who really is one of the world's great experts on these issues, and a woman whose writings I consult when I'm asked about them. So you're very lucky to have her here, and we'll all learn from her. So the 5 points that I want to make to you is the first is that there is no crisis in democratic process or outcomes in Canada. The second is that though there is no crisis, even superior systems can be improved, as the history of Canadian democratic practice shows. And I want to outline some of those important improvements in the various elements of how one runs elections. Third point, which I don't have to emphasize because Professor Norris has already done it, which is that there's no perfect electoral system. There are advantages and disadvantages to all of them, and it is really a question of values, of differing perspectives that will inform your own debate. So there's no technical solution to the issue of electoral reform. It is basically a political process of deciding your purposes and values and what you value most. In answering the question that, again, Professor Norris said, which is, if our system, in fact, operates pretty well, what is the reform? What problem are you trying to solve? The fourth point I want to emphasize is that a consensus in a committee like this is crucial, it's difficult, but it's attainable. And I want to refer to my own experience, the chairman raised it, about the creation of the special committee, Joint Committee on the Constitution in 1980-81, which had an even more difficult set of issues than you're grappling with, but eventually was able to reach a consensus. Difficult one. And lastly, and perhaps the most important of my various points to you, is that electoral reform, your issue, is just one piece of the democratic reform agenda. There is still lots of work to do, even as you grapple with the issue of electoral reform. And electoral reform itself has such a tremendous impact on the role of the House, the apex of accountability, that I would recommend to you that as you grapple with all the technical issues and the difficult issues that you must do so, and Professor Norris has raised them, you keep in mind what are the complementary reforms which will be necessary to make our system work on whatever system that you choose. So, very quickly then, on those 5 points, that there's no crisis in Canadian democratic practice. We have had in this country in recent years a tremendous crisis, in my view, in the role of the Senate. And that was leading to tremendous disrespect for a critical institution in Parliament. The new government, though, has moved with dispatch, and I think with boldness, in trying to reform the Senate, in making it merit-based, independent, nonpartisan. These are difficult and interesting challenges ahead to make that system work in our parliamentary system. But that was a crisis, and it was addressed. I think there is less of a crisis when we look at electoral systems. When we look at the various assessments internationally, the World Bank, for example, which sponsors a worldwide governance indicator project, in 2014, Canada had ratings of 96% in accountability, 91% in political stability, 95% in government effectiveness, 98% in regulatory policy, 95% in the rule of law, and 94% in control of corruption. Absolutely in the top 10 of attainment. Professor Norris's own electoral integrity project had Canada again as probably the, she can correct me, but I think it was at the top of the majoritarian practitioners of electoral systems at a rating around 75 to 80 ahead of the United States and so on. Again, in that absolute top rank. And this international assessment about the value of Canadian government practice and electoral practice then, of course, has led, as we all know, famously, to the Human Development Index of the United Nations, where Canada has always been in the top 10, sometimes has been number 1. I think in 2014 we were number 9. But the strength of our government system and our electoral system has certainly had a positive impact on those achievements in the Human Development Index. And that is because, pride of position here, the Westminster system, with its combination of a concentration of power to get things done, combined with an accountability related back to what David Smith, the brilliant scholar from Saskatchewan, calls the People's House of Commons, that combination of people sovereignty as represented in the House, but the concentration of power for effective government, is really the secret of the Westminster system when it is working correctly. And for most of our history, it has been working correctly in Canada. So, the second point then. But even, as I would argue, that our Westminster system is superior, everything can be improved. And the history of Canadian electoral practice, when you look at it, in all the dimensions of running elections, voter registration, election management, how wide is your franchise, party financing, those relative important pillars of how one runs elections, in every one of them over the last 300 years, Canada has made tremendous changes and innovations. It's been a constant record of reform, leading to the building of those institutions which have let us get such high responses on these international results that I have talked about. So everything from most of them initiated initially in the provinces, Quebec, leading the way on election financing, Manitoba leading the way on votes for women, New Brunswick on the secret ballot. We can look at all aspects of elections, and there have been a constant series of innovations in them. The third point, then, that there is no perfect electoral system. I won't go into that because we've just heard a very learned discussion on it. The committee process. Let me just quickly remind you about that joint committee that we talked about. It met for months. It had hundreds of submissions. But there were two key elements on why it worked on that very difficult process. The first was timing. That the committee asked for, and Mr. Trudeau, the first Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, my Prime Minister Trudeau, gave that committee length of time. He had a strong deadline, but changed that deadline to accommodate the needs of the committee, which asked for more time. So the question for this committee is that the timing issue should be flexible in order for you to get it right. And secondly, equally critically, every party, the representatives of every party, had a tremendous impact on that committee. If I remember correctly, for example, the Conservatives on the Charter of Rights debate proposed over 20 amendments, which I think 7 or so were accepted by the government. The NDP proposed 40, of which over 20 were accepted. The point is that the government was open and encouraged a consensus, and the committee then, though some had basic disagreement with the whole project, worked hard to make the substance work. So consensus can work. And lastly, and I'll just end here, if this committee can achieve consensus, if you're given enough time to do so, or the government gives itself enough time to do this right rather than arbitrary deadlines, then as soon as you do that, there is a whole host of additional agenda items that have to be covered, including election debates, the role of Parliament itself, civic literacy, and many groups, not least of which is our group at Massey College, that has a 2-year program on a democratic agenda, including the idea of party policy foundations. There is much more to do once you help Canada solve this question of electoral reform.
Thank you so much, Professor Axworthy, for bringing so many new and original insights to the discussion. Professor Harrington, please, for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored to be here today, and I appreciate the opportunity to address the committee. I should like to confine my remarks to just 2 points, the first of which is constitutional, and the second is political. The first issue to be considered is the extent to which a change in the current members of electing, the process of electing members of the House implicates the amending provisions of the Canadian Constitution. Yeah. As the committee are no doubt aware, this issue is whether the committee can, or whether Parliament can proceed under Section 44, or whether it must use the general amending procedures, also known as the 70 or 750 formula set out in Section 42. And as perhaps you are also aware, a great deal of ink has been spilled recently by academics in law and politics debating this particular question. The newspapers have been filled with editorials by various scholars contending that the abolition of first past the post may be done by Parliament alone under Section 44, whilst others contend that a new electoral system will require the consent of the provinces under Section 42. The degree of certainty expressed by my colleagues in this literature is rather puzzling to me, for I believe that any conclusion is premature at this stage. It would appear to me that the decision or the question of which amending procedure is required must abide the advent of an actual proposal. This is because I believe that the Supreme Court's recent jurisprudence on amending the Constitution has created a great deal of ambiguity and confusion, so much so I think that it's now nearly impossible to determine whether a change in the method of electing members of either branch of Parliament is significant enough to require provincial consent. In short, while I'd like to say that changing the method of electing the members of the House of Commons might be done under this section or that section of Part 5 of the Constitution, if asked, I would be constrained like any evasive lawyer to say that I'd have to get back to you on that. And that's simple, because the Supreme Court has made a muddle of the amending process. The starting point for the analysis is the Supreme Court reference and the Senate reference. In both these questions, or both these cases rather, the court took up the question of how do the composition of institutions, or how may they be changed? And in both cases, the Supreme Court took an extremely limited view of the process of constitutional amendment, on the grounds that amendments which work a substantial change to the essential character of an institution, or where such a change would affect the rights of the provinces in a significant way, must utilize the 750 process. In both cases, the courts refused to limit its analysis to a purely textual review of the constitutional provisions, and this is significant. On the contrary, the court held that amendments to the Constitution are not confined merely to textual changes. They include changes to the constitutional architecture, although the court does not define for us exactly what the constitutional architecture is. And it is this reliance on constitutional architecture that poses significant problems for navigating the waters of amendment. As of this moment, it seems difficult to predict whether the court might regard changes to the electoral system as merely housekeeping matters, allowing use of Section 44, or whether such changes would constitute an alteration to the fundamental nature or role of the House, and thus require the 750 formula. My own view is that eliminating the first-past-the-post system might implicate Section 42, given the court's treatment of recent attempts to alter the manner of selecting senators and justices. In striking down the attempt to create a system of advisory elections for the Senate and an accompanying proposal for term limits, The court made clear that changes that would fundamentally alter the Senate's role as a body designed to provide for sober second thought would be constitutionally suspect. Some have argued that we can ignore the Senate reference on the grounds that there are specific provisions in the Constitution dealing with the appointment of senators. But in the Supreme Court reference, the court struck down an attempt to alter the qualifications of justices. And bear in mind that in the Supreme Court reference, what was before the court was an act of Parliament. What was before the court was an attempt by Parliament to change one of its own statutes. And the court declared that Parliament's authority to amend the Supreme Court Act was limited because the Act has, over time, essentially taken on a constitutional character. One might argue, therefore, that any attempt to alter the essential character of an institution, or any attempt to alter a system of selecting members, which then changes its essential character, would trigger that 750 formula. The use of constitutional architecture in the Senate reference, as well as the concept of essential features in the Supreme Court reference, I think are so devoid of precision and substance that one cannot say in advance whether a specific proposal will trigger the requirement for the 750 general amending provision. Moreover, one might wonder whether the court would actually be inclined to treat the Elections Act as it did the Supreme Court Act, and declare that first past the post is entrenched in the constitutional architecture. The Supreme Court Act of 1875 established the initial qualifications for judges. One would have thought Parliament would have been able to change that, but the court declared it could not do so. After the long period of time, it has become part of the furniture. One might question whether the Elections Act and various predecessors have done exactly that. I don't say, I wonder. At this point, therefore, I think the committee is regrettably in the position of having to anticipate in advance whether any specific proposal will disturb the court's so far nebulous concept of constitutional architecture, or significantly alter what it calls the essential features of the House. If pressed, I would suggest there are two ways that the committee might do that, or any proposal might do that. The first would be any system of voting which alters the relationship or the rights or the powers of the provinces. Perhaps a significant reworking of ridings, which would dilute representation in some way. A far greater concern, perhaps, is whether any reform system would substantially affect the relationship between the Prime Minister and the House. It could be argued that a Westminster-style government implies the stability provided by a Prime Minister able to control the House without frequent resort to coalition. I regret that I can't be more specific on this point, and I dare say that anybody who comes forward and says, oh, go ahead and use Section 44, ask them if they're willing to bet the House on that. Because until such time as the court defines essential features or constitutional architecture, no one can ever really predict whether any proposal that comes from the House will be regarded as a mere housekeeping, thus implicating Section 44, or whether it is a substantial change requiring use of the general amending formula. The point I would really like to make simply is there is no way to know at this point. My political point is rather more straightforward. Regardless of the constitutional question, I would suggest to the committee that some form of direct consultation with the Canadian people is required, and I think everyone agrees with that. And the arguments for a referendum have been rehearsed elsewhere, and I think little would be gained by me recapping them here. But my own view is that referenda are incompatible with a Westminster-style government. I believe firmly in the sovereignty of Parliament, and I think it is regrettable that the Canadian Parliament has, in recent decades, become rather timid in asserting its place in the constitutional system. I think both the House and the Senate ought to be more vigorous in asserting parliamentary prerogative. After all, the essence of the Westminster system is that the people are best represented in their Parliament, and not in the courts and not in the executive. To some of my colleagues, I know that makes me a bit of an anachronism, a dinosaur, in suggesting that the most appropriate way for electoral reform to be accomplished is by a subsequent parliamentary election. At present, I don't believe that it's possible for us to claim that there is a mandate, a democratic mandate, for any particular electoral reform. I would suggest, therefore, that the most appropriate way to gauge the support of the Canadian people would be for the government to go to the country a second time. At various times in our history, significant issues have been presented to the people in the form of election. Recall the 1988 election, which was fought primarily on the question of whether the North American Free Trade Agreement ought to be ratified. In conclusion, I would suggest that the most appropriate way to gauge the consent of the people would be for the government to prepare a proposal which can be the basis of a subsequent election. And that might occur by having the government resign right now, a prospect I know is fatuous in the extreme, or simply wait till the next election. In short, the most appropriate thing to do is to make the 2019 election about electoral reform. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Professeur Harrington, et merci.
Thank you very much, Professor Harrington, and I'd like to thank all of the witnesses. Before beginning the round, I'd just like to take a moment to explain to the witnesses how the question and answer period will function. We'll have 2 rounds, and during each round, each member has the right to ask questions, well, more than one question, but the question and answer has to be combined within that 5-minute period that they have. So if you haven't been able to answer within the 5-minute period, you will have the opportunity later on when you have the floor to reply to the previous question. So it doesn't limit the debate in any way. It's just that we have to have some kind of structure that's logical for the meeting. So the first round will begin with Ms. Sahota.
Thank you for all the witnesses for being here today. I really found these presentations very intriguing. I think some of the best we've had. My question, I guess, all the presentations to some degree discussed educational components, and Dr. Axworthy, you have spent quite a lot of time on civics and heritage and education. What do you think would be the best approach for this committee to take, whether it's in the time frame we have now or whether it's in an extended time frame that you were suggesting? How do we best approach the people? And regardless of whether this is for a referendum or whether it's for some assemblies or whether it's going to be for just the purpose of our town halls and consultations that this committee is going to be doing, how do we make sure that the people that are coming forward with from a place of being educated on this issue, and they can understand the gravity of the issue, they can understand why the need for them to come forward and participate in this dialogue is so important? How do we go about doing that?
Well, of course, there are a variety of techniques on consultation right up into what is called deep engagement. So I'm sure your committee staff and so on have a whole host of techniques to assist members as they go back to the writings or as part of this committee process. But one idea that I would suggest to you, and I believe my former colleague from Queens, Jonathan Rose, also raised as a further technique to the role of parliamentarians itself in looking at these sets of issues. If the timing deadline is flexible, as I've argued, and perhaps even into the next election, one technique would be, in fact, to actually create citizens' assemblies or a jury in regions or in provinces where citizens are selected impartially. It is not just those who have a point of view to come forward, but are selected impartially. And those citizens are then themselves grappling with the issues, the same issues that you're grappling with as legislators. And I've always found, in my experience, and this has been experimented in a variety of provinces, that the use of the independent citizen jury system is a very good complement to the work of parliamentarians, particularly around some of these values issues that I talked about. So when I would look at, you have your own processes as a committee, but if you are coming down to alternatives, 2 or 3 that should be looked upon, I would take a very hard look at complementary or after this committee process to look at a citizen jury process.
Okay. And how would you see these citizens' assemblies formulated, because we are dealing with such a grand scope? We've seen them done at the province level, but how do we do it at the national level where we have a good cross-section of people that we need? How do we go about it practically?
The process would be a large one. I mean, it was large enough in British Columbia and Ontario. So it would have to be organized in every province and region. So this would be a very large undertaking. But I think if the time were sufficient and the education process were large, including, for example, televising the hearings so that the kinds of experts and people who you're having the benefit of listening to today would be replicated across the country. I would have the independent panels by province and area.
Interesting. Doctor, you've talked a bit about, you did a report on parliamentary reform. From those recommendations, can you tell me which ones could be implemented by this committee studying electoral reform?
30 seconds, please. Yeah.
Is there enough time?
Yeah, 30 seconds about.
Oh, well, it was about a 200-page report, so in 15 seconds, in looking at the major recommendations, I think one of the crucial aspects to it is the role of committees such as your own. One of our specific recommendations, for example, is that the chairs of committees should be paid the same as a cabinet minister. That is, chairs of committee were so important that in terms
I'm in favor of that, by the way.
This is...
if you need more time, Mr. Ackworthy, just go.
That was worth a minute, anyway. and that members should have committees, and they should be able to join for the whole term, so that committees build up expertise. Part of the countervailing is have committees as a countervail to the power of the executive.
Thank you.
I take a lot of look at the committee system.
Thanks very much. Okay, Mr. Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to begin by pointing out the plight of our underpaid vice chairs.
It's turning into a collective bargaining session.
My questions are for Professor Norris. Professor, you referred with respect and with admiration, I think, to the process by which New Zealand adopted its new electoral reform system, the MMP system, in the 1990s. Others, at least one other witness, has been much less respectful of at least the motives of those who set up the process, although I think people are universal in their respect for the maturity with which New Zealand voters dealt with the system. I want to go back and just ask you a couple of questions about this. The New Zealanders are the masters of something that I don't think exists anywhere else in the world, which is the preferential referendum, the referendum where you have more than 2 options. And I wanted to ask you a bit about this. So in 1992-93, what happened was that in 92, the New Zealanders held a referendum with 2 questions. The first was, are you in favor of getting rid of first past the post, to which 84.7% said yes. The second question was then, which system you favor. And happily, this produced a majority in favor of one system, 65% in favor of MMP, because it was not a preferential ballot. It was actually just list off your preferences. And we could have had a big schlemazel where 20% might have gone for each of the alternatives, or at least no majority for any alternative. That was done. Then a year later, more or less, a second referendum was held, MMP versus first past the post. Subsequent to that, they've had a second preferential referendum, which is structured differently over their flag. This occurred in 2 stages, in November of last year, March of 2016. And in this case, what they did was the structure was somewhat different. There you ranked the 4 preferred options that had been chosen by a select committee first. in order, and then in the second ballot you took the winning candidate and voted versus the status quo. I'm just wondering, looking at those different variations, if you have any thoughts as to what is the best way of approaching a preferential referendum.
And I think that's a very good question, thinking about the process. And so, Mr. Reid, I think that we can contrast New Zealand and the UK. So we know about Brexit, but we also know about the vote which they had on the alternative vote system. And those referendums, I think, were a problem in lots of different ways as a process, never mind the outcome, but particularly in terms of electoral reform, when people were asked did they want AV or not, as a simple yes-no, then this wasn't the option that most parties wanted, or politicians, or the public. In fact, the Liberal Democrats wanted a different system, and so did some of the Scott Nats and so on. So the choice itself was a problem, and of course it got turned down as a result, and people said, let's go for the safe thing. In New Zealand, by contrast, as you say, having that two-step process really lets the public as a whole say, do we want to keep the status quo or not? And then the question about each of the different choices is really a question of the public education, because people aren't aware of what it means to have preferential voting, or how STV works in Ireland, or how alternative votes work in other countries. So it does take a long time to really inform the public with really good neutral, balanced and educational programs about what the options might be on the table. So I think the New Zealand model is one which Canada, if you go down the referendum route, should certainly think very hard about. And it gives people a choice then in two stages. One is the familiar system or something else. And if you want something else, then it gives an opportunity for the parties and interest groups, electoral reform societies, the general citizens, and other forms of different lobbying groups to really think through what the best option might be. And if one looks at New Zealand versus the UK, New Zealand far ahead in terms of the process.
Thank you. Do I have any time left? Or
About 40 seconds.
So the two referendum cycles on the different questions, the flag and the electoral system, were structured differently. Do you have any thoughts as to which is the better of the two ways of structuring what effectively is a two-question and preferential process?
Really briefly,
So I thought that,
difficult question, but
yeah, I just thought the system which they used for the electoral reform was better than the system which they used for the flag, which of course got voted down in the end, cost a lot, and didn't actually get through. So the first system worked with a longer period between the first and the second of the different referendums, allowing more chance for deliberation.
thank you. Monsieur Boulris.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Professor, for being with us, Madam, and other two professors here as well. It's very instructive and very interesting. I'd like to ask Professor Norris a question first. Your Californian colleague, Mr. Liphart, boasted about the virtues about certain kinds of proportional representation for the cultures of parties. That is to say that the parties would have a more conciliatory position. And I would like to ask you a question about how this might change the culture among voters. Sometimes, you know, with the system that we have, and the first past the post, people like to vote strategically. So they often do not vote for their first choice or the choice that's in their own interest or represents their own convictions, but they'll vote against another political party. So I'm not going to point fingers here, but I know some people in Toronto, for example, wanted to vote for candidate A because they wanted to make sure that candidate C would not be elected, and they ended up with B. So do you think that with some kind of proportional representation, it would force people to stop having that kind of an attitude?
Can be seen as a problem, but it can also be seen as a virtue for other reasons. Think about, for example, the second ballot system which is used in France. That's a majoritarian system, and it's designed to create large parties. So in the first ballot in France, in the presidential elections or the Chamber of Deputies, you vote with your heart, you vote for the party that you really love or that is closest to your policies and interests. In the second, you're forced to only vote for the top two. So you have to vote strategically if you had supported a minor party before, and de Gaulle introduced that to try and make sure that there was a broad consensus in the support for the presidency. So strategic voting per se is not necessarily something normatively, I think, which is problematic, and it's used very widely in many, many countries. And so I'm not sure that clearly the different systems have different consequences for strategic voting. You can also vote strategically, of course, under a proportional representation system again, depending on where your party is in the rankings. And you need to look, for example, at your district, and you need to think, how many candidates are there in your district? And that's a matter for calculation strategically by the parties, as well as for the voters. If, for example, you're weak in a district, you might only have one candidate in a party list. If you have a system which you're feeling very strong, you'll put all the candidates forward. But strategic voting you can't get rid of necessarily by having either PR or mixed member systems or first past the post. And therefore it's not something which is necessarily one which is going to be eradicated by a reform. I'm not surprised, by the way, to know that Professor Leichhardt supports PR. That's always been his argument, and I very much respect his views.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to New Zealand, but not necessarily on the process that brought about the change, but the consequences of that. I know that you're also interested in women's participation in various electoral systems. In 1990, only 16% of MPs in New Zealand were women, and in 1906, it was almost 29% that were women MPs then. So what do you attribute that to? Was it a change of culture or a change of voting system?
We can see the same thing in Germany and in other countries which have mixed member systems. So it's far more difficult for women and other minorities to get elected under first past the post in single member districts than it is under the party list. In single member districts, the people who are recruiting candidates only pick one candidate for their riding or for their constituency. And so they might well go for a safe choice, which is often seen as a candidate who might have experience in a particular way or kind of fits the mould of a politician. Under a party list, you've got basically a range of different candidates. You want to balance. So you want to balance by class, you might want to balance by language, you might want to balance by gender or by ethnicity. But essentially, when you're selecting on a party list, you don't want to discriminate against any group because you might have a loss of popularity, a loss of votes. So the way that the systems work means that essentially, and we've known this since the 1980s, proportional representation has the strongest representation for women overall. Mixed member system, women get in through the party list. Under first past the post, it becomes more difficult at the selection or recruitment stage for women to get selected and therefore to get elected.
Merci.
On the other hand, okay, and you can also use quotas, obviously.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Saint.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saint-Marie. Thank you, madam. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming today. It's very interesting. My question is for Mr. Harrington, and I would also like Mr. Axworthy and Madam Norris's opinions as well. Canada is a federation made up of several nations, one majority and some minority, and this was structured this way in order to ensure respect for everyone, and of course the electoral system was as well. So what should be the criteria to ensure that these minorities are protected?
I'm not sure. Is the question which system I think would work best?
Non, peu importe le système où on peut.
Regardless of the system, we can speak. If you talk about proportional, a mixed member proportional, or in the absolute, what would be required in the reform to continue to protect the rights of minority nations that was in the spirit of the founding of the Federation?
The question, since I'm a lawyer and not a political scientist, and one or one of the great I think one of the great problems is that we assume lawyers know everything, and or people think, and I say it's very important to bear in mind that the role of lawyers. I can write the statute, I can write the provision, but as to whether this or that system is a better system or works is really a political science question. And so I would defer to Professor Norris. And unfortunately, we have a tendency when we read all the op-eds, all the law professors now are opining on which is the best political system. And I say, we know nothing about that kind of thing. I hate to be flippant about it, but I think it's really a question of intensive study of politics and empirical and anecdotal research that lawyers in general, and particularly law professors, really don't do. And so from my mind, I almost began by saying I come here agnostic about the question. I'm not here to suggest one or another system, and I'm sorry about that.
Je me faisais une image des avocats.
I was having a mental image of all of what I've heard from lawyers up until now, but perhaps Mr. Axworthy or Professor Norris could answer.
The question of minorities, that the crucial aspect about democracy and efficacy is really your knowledge as an individual, and that there are particular minorities, I'm thinking, for example, of recent immigrants to Canada, where the education and the knowledge about our system is more problematic because of the fact that they have emigrated. So I think that a country should be looking at those who have more barriers to participation, and in this case around knowledge. Just an illustration, a case in point, for example, in learning about our system. We bring in 250,000 people a year. They have to know about our background of federalism in Canada, the Canadian story. For example, the historic minutes, the 75 or 80 minutes about the history of the country in those television snappers. Why don't we, for example, translate those into a variety of different Chinese and Spanish and others, and every immigrant who arrives gets the history of Canada in their language in an easily digestible form rather than a long book and a series of reports. So we have legal equality in the country, we have disparities in knowledge, and we have disparities in engagement. That's what we have to work on.
Il vous reste à peu près 20 secondes.
Oui, Madame Norris, vouliez-vous répondre?
20 secondes. You have about 20 seconds, Ms. Norris, Professor Norris.
So diversity is really critical, particularly because societies now are increasingly globalized, and with emigre populations, they need to have citizenship rights and voices in representative bodies like Parliament. There are a couple of things that can be done. Clearly, if you're going to go towards a mixed member or a proportional system, the districts can be based on provinces. So in that sense, you don't change the familiar boundaries, you just have multi-member districts within that. If you're going to stick with first past the post, there are still things that can be done. And again, think of New Zealand. You can have reserved seats or quotas for particular minorities, such as indigenous groups, who are concentrated in particular areas and who need to get representation. About 20 or so countries around the world have reserved seats for those types of groups. So we can do some things.
Thanks very much. Okay, Ms. May.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to start with, and I'll also admit that I was once a practicing lawyer. It's been a while since I've been in practice, so I'm not insured. But we have had a number of constitutional lawyers' briefs. The most recent was Benoit Pelletier from University of Ottawa, who did, I thought, a quite brilliant and concise review of the BNA Act, the Constitution Act of 1982, all the leading Supreme Court cases, looked at fundamental principles, and then set out a course, well, as long as you don't do the following. I don't know, did you see Professor Pelletier's testimony?
Yes.
Okay, so in terms of his conditions, he said if you don't trip any of these tripwires, you've got clear sailing for Parliament to amend electoral reform. And I thought your question is, why are these people so certain? That seemed to me to be a fairly cautious and well-informed path forward.
Yes, I think that I'm in the minority on this. I do recognize that a number of my colleagues suggest that this is a Section 44 problem. I just think that given Well, I will say this. First, I think no matter what Parliament come up with, this will be litigated, and sadly. And secondly, I think that the court has not given really any guidance, and I see the list, the checklist, if you will, the recipe for success. But the court seems rather capricious in this. In other words, the court, in defining its own structure, the court discussed the fact that that if you attempt to alter the essential characteristics of the Supreme Court, you're going to need provincial consent. But nowhere did it bother to explain to us what the essential characteristics of the Supreme Court were. And when you look at the House and the electoral system, I think it's not unlikely, or it's not unreasonable, that the court would have to take on that question as well. I mean, we recognize that we haven't had, we've used different, well, people will say, well, and we've always used first past the post. That's not true in the Westminster system, as we all know. It isn't necessarily entrenched by virtue of the Constitution Act 1867, but it seems to have become, it arguably has become entrenched over time. And so I think when you look at the idea of changing the qualifications for justices, which is a statute of Parliament, and the court says the usage is such that it is firmly entrenched, and now you're talking about something that at least has been in practice even longer. I'm just not sanguine about the point.
So, and of course, in 1867, the UK parliamentary tradition included multi-member districts. So if anything is entrenched, it would have to include multi-member districts. But I think that, as you say, you're in a minority in thinking that there are issues here. I wanted to also ask Professor Axworthy and you again, Professor Harrington, and I'm only leaving you out, Dr. Norris, because it's such a Canadian question, but if you have a view, let me know. Would you see any benefit in the government of the day putting a reference to Supreme Court? If the court then, do you see, are there any issues here that require engagement at other levels? Is this a constitutional matter, or are we correct in believing, as I believe, that it's up to the Parliament of Canada to decide what the voting system is? If the court refuses to take the reference, it's a pretty clear sign they don't see an issue. If they do take the reference, it clarifies things before the system is first engaged. It's just an out-of-the-box idea. I just wonder if Professor Axworthy or Professor Harrington have any views on that as a cautionary approach.
You go first.
1 minute.
I would agree with you that I think that this is an area where Parliament ought to assert its sovereignty and not defer to the court.
Yes, I exactly the same. That when I talked about all of the major changes, from the secret ballot to an independent election commissioner to independent boundaries commissioners, really crucial aspects of our system, they were all done through Parliament, and so this should be.
Thank you. 10 seconds.
Well, I will then assert the supremacy of Parliament and assure you that we will take control of this issue and resolve it in a forthright fashion.
Thank you very much. Monsieur de Courcy for 5 minutes.
De Courcy for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses.
Mr. Axworthy, and I appreciated your comments that remind us to temper some of the hyperbolic rhetoric that floats around this conversation around crises, while also keeping us mindful of the need to work towards improvements. I wonder if you can maybe lay out some of the most important improvements that this committee can work together upon.
Well, the Democratic agenda is a large one, but of particular direct importance for a committee that will be making recommendations to changes to the electoral system. Should you choose or recommend a more proportional system or a mixed member system, which the likelihood then of majority governments becomes less at a minimum, not impossible, but tending toward the representation side as opposed to the effective or efficiency side of government, then if that occurs, it becomes all the more important for Parliament House of Commons to work as an institution, to work in a minority or a coalition kind of situation. And that means that what members do in a legislature is at least as important as how they get there. And there are a host of suggestions have been made around the uses of committee systems, the role of member statements, breaking up of omnibus legislation, asserting programs around prorogation, the kinds of resources that are necessary for the use of the committee systems, the role of caucus research bureaus for better staff. I mentioned some of the suggestions that we had made in our report about the committee system. In essence, what this means is that Parliament itself, and my argument to you and to this committee, is that as important as a reform agenda around our electoral system, and of those 6 pillars, it's the only one which hasn't changed since 1867. But just as important then, as a critical element then, would be to take the House of Commons seriously, its role as the People's House of Commons, and that means a real revitalization of the role of member of parliaments, particularly through the committee systems. And there's a long list of suggestions. So the Democratic agenda is large, and I can talk more about civic literacy and the role of party foundations, education, but the next agenda absolutely then should be reform of the House of Commons.
And how would you advise us to deliver this in a digestible way when we consult with Canadians talking about the larger democratic restructuring or renewal at play, and maybe the way that different systems will help precipitate changes to democracy?
I would recommend, again, to end where you began, which is not overhyping any of these systems. I mean, we know from Pippa Norris's work, the kind of system you have is important. It has an impact, but it's not necessarily the predominant factor. There's a whole host of other issues like political culture, the quality of the people running, and so on. And I think that this is a area that requires some modesty, both in touting its impacts and also touting its defects. So, yes, our system can be improved. Will it be transformative? No.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll come back to others second round.
Thank you very much. So we'll now move on to Mr. Richards, please, for 5.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Professor Harrington, come to you, I think, first of all. You had certainly indicated that you think it's of vital importance that people are directly and substantially consulted on the question of changing the voting system. You mentioned in your opening remarks, and I think subsequently, a couple of different ways that could occur in your mind. You mentioned briefly the idea of referendum, and I think you indicated that you're not generally a fan of referendum, but my sense was that much like other witnesses we've had here, you feel this might be an exceptional circumstance where a referendum would be required, and I'll let you answer that in a second and confirm that. But you also mentioned the idea of going directly to an election, whether that be the government resigning now, which I think there's probably a number of members in this room who probably would think that's a bad idea. I'd personally be okay with it, but for other reasons. But whether it was the case that they resigned or whether they called the 2019 election on that issue, it sounded to me like you were sort of indicating that would be a way to have this be legitimized. But I wanted to just clarify, did you also feel that if that wasn't the case, that a referendum would be another way to legitimize that?
Yes. Yes, I admittedly, I take a rather high church view of Parliament and its role in the system. And I think that I think that the most appropriate way for this matter to be resolved is for this to be the subject of an electoral campaign, which of course means that it's likely 2019. And I know promises or expectations have been raised, but I don't think that this is an incredibly complex question, as everyone knows, and I don't think anyone should feel an obligation to rush through this process just to fulfill campaign expectations. And so I would, if I were in charge for the day, I would suggest that the most appropriate way it would be to spend this Parliament resolving this question and place the proposal before the voters in a Westminster-style election, and deal with it that way, so that a new government takes office with the support of the people for whatever proposal has been developed.
If I can just
obviously
stop you there, because I'm assuming I don't have a lot of time, Mr. Chair.
Oh, sorry.
Minute and 45.
Okay, so let me, because there was one sort of a follow-up question I'd like to ask, is because you had an interesting article in the Montreal Gazette back in January where you indicated that you felt if the government was to try and proceed without taking it to the people in one form or the other, that you felt that this would be a time where the Senate should maybe make a step to act in the democratic interests of Canadians and say to block the government's bill in order to force them to either to take it to the people in some way. And I just wanted to get your sense. I mean, why you think that kind of rare action by the Senate would be justified and legitimate if it was necessary.
Yeah, my hate mail on that is spectacular. Yes, my fallback is referendum. I mean, I think there has to be some mode by which there is a formal consultation with the people. And I was reacting at the time to the assertion that there would be neither. There would be neither election nor referendum, in which case, as I have said, that is the Senate's function as well, as I have a high church view of the Senate, that the Senate's role would be to impede the process in order that the people should be consulted, as was done with NAFTA.
So to be very clear, what you're saying is that in order to have properly, legitimately asked the people for their consent, it would either be an election on the issue or a referendum. That's the way that we could ensure that people have been adequately and properly asked for their consent.
Briefly, yes or no, if you can.
Yes.
There you go. Thank you very much. Ms. Romanato.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to thank all three of you for being here on a sunny August afternoon. Dr. Axworthy and Professor Norris, you both mentioned that there is no perfect electoral system, and we have heard that from other witnesses. And you've also mentioned that no system will address every value that we hold dear. This committee was given a mandate with specific guidelines to help us in that quest to find the perfect solution that we hope we will be able to find on a consensus basis. But given that one of the overarching concerns that we've been hearing from Canadians is their relationship with their local representative, and I know it's the same for MPs that have been elected, that they like to know that they have that relationship with their constituents. Now, we heard in a multi-member proportional situation, there would be some confusion on behalf of who handles what, who's my representative, and we might lose that link between the Canadian and their representative. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that, given the fact that it is such a value that is held dear by Canadians, what you would think about the impact of implementing something like MMP model.
Pippa, do you want to go first?
Would you like me to go first?
Go for it.
So basically, think about the Bundestag. So here we have two MPs who are elected through different methods. One is the single-member district, and one is the person who's elected in the party list. And so clearly, there isn't a lot of ambiguity in the sense that there still is that link between the individual member and their local constituency, their local voters, their local party, and all those other things which are really important in any parliamentary representation. So you can have a mixed member system which basically has, to some extent, the best of those two different worlds, but it does mean then that members of parliament are slightly different in their roles and responsibilities and how much they do. For example, constituency service, which is an incredibly valuable service, takes up a lot of time, and is really, I know, appreciated in any parliamentary system, versus those who are focused on perhaps more committee work or issues or other types of concerns for Parliament. So you just kind of divide the roles a little bit more than you might do under the current system.
Yeah, my answer is would be quite similar. That I also put a high among the various principles in the mandate of this committee. The local identification to me is terrifically important for a couple of reasons. The first is when we look at the frustrations of citizens with our system, much of it revolves around the frustrations of how to deal with government itself, the complexities, the confusions, the weights. Members of Parliament serve as really an ombudsman, the final step you can go to try to resolve these terrible sets of issues that in the daily life of Canadians that they face. It's just about the only recourse for so many citizens when they're up against waiting times and long periods of difficulty. So in a globalized world, when things get ever larger, to have that personal identification to me is absolutely crucial. But then how would we divide, as Professor Norris then just said, particularly if we continue to have the mixed member where we had, in my view, hopefully still a heavy orientation toward the single member district, but there would then be some as a top-up on the list. Well, then the natural division is that part of the top-up, those who are on the larger vote would be concentrating on more national issues, parliamentary issues, and so on, leaving the members to do the local surgery, which is the real bread and butter work of members of Parliament, which just about only they can do.
Do I have a few seconds? Okay. Professor Norris, just quickly, given the values that Canadians hold dear, what would your thoughts be in terms of transitioning to a ranked ballot before transitioning to an MMP?
So just on that last point, I was also just thinking, on representation, you also have to think about minor parties. So the old idea of parliamentary representation is you go through your MP, irrespective of party or party, you are representing the constituency you're the member of. So it does mean that smaller parties are excluded. If you have a mixed member system, smaller parties are more likely to be there, so you don't necessarily need to go through an MP. You can go through a different channel to get representation. In terms of rank preferences, essentially that's another choice. It's a more majoritarian system if one goes towards a preferential vote, and that has certain consequences for party representation. But I don't think you should think of it, as it were, as a sequential step. It's basically a choice that you need to make, and you don't want to say, well, let's have that and then further down the road, because you don't want instability. Every electoral system takes time to work its way out and to work out what the consequences are, and particularly for voters to know how to actually act within that choices in terms of the ballot or in terms of districts, right? So you don't want to do two choices.
Thanks very much. Monsieur Dubé.
Oui, merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to speak English because I want to quote a text that you wrote, Mr. Axworthy, at the time of 2004 minority government.
And it was the first one since the 1970s at that point. You write, policy actually gets made on the floor of the Commons, which is important, of course. And you say the whole focus of Ottawa shifts from quiet discussions between deputy ministers to the public and noisy negotiations between politicians in the cockpit of Parliament. And if I just rewind a little bit, you also mentioned how it was important that nothing will erase the democratic deficit faster than the election of a minority parliament. The House of Commons becomes king, power slips away from the executive towards the legislature. Now, I raise these points because I'm wondering, when we talk about mixed member proportional, we often talk about the best of both worlds. And if we look at examples like Germany, where contrary to popular belief, there can be a lot of stability in a proportional system. Coupling that with what you wrote then, could we reach the conclusion that a proportional system would lead to those same kind of negotiations like we see in a minority parliament, and yet in a little more of a stable system where, as you mentioned, not to discredit your article, because you mentioned it further, I don't want to omit anything, parties played a big role and there's that constant sense of election. Removing that but keeping the good stuff, where MPs are taking their roles much more seriously than perhaps they do when it's 4 years of a majority government.
Yeah, look, we can make any system work. Under a majority government system, much of the work goes on within caucus. I've been recommending here and others, as I also did at that time, a very expanded system around the committee system. But the one result of having more parties or larger numbers of smaller parties is that kind of work then takes place on the floor of the House of Commons. That is, we have internal coalition building now. It takes place within larger national parties often, the brokerage function of parties. And not to dismiss that, that's been a crucial aspect of the history of the country in terms of accommodation. That kind of process could still occur. It would be in a different kind of way. It would have to be motivated by the same values of tolerance and give and take, which we sometimes lose in the hyper-partisan atmosphere of Parliament. But it could certainly occur. And again, I don't want to paint some terrible world of coalitions. They can also operate. I've mentioned the Constitutional Committee. People often forget that Mr. Trudeau also invited Mr. Broadbent to join his cabinet at that time, because we wanted to expand the legitimacy of the constitutional project. So that was the kind of spirit there was at that time. That's the kind of spirit we would need to make minority parliaments work. Is it doable? Yes, it is.
Merci. Madame Norris, j'ai une question si on parle...
Thank you, Professor Norris. If we remain on the same theme of the proportional system, but we also talk about parliamentary reform. Often when we look at the proportional system, we talk about the power of the smaller parties, but we mustn't forget that there are other members who work hard, and just to say that members by themselves become more powerful. It's not just a small party that becomes part of it, but the MPs from the bigger parties as well. So is that fair to say that? Or perhaps you could speak to that point.
Point is absolutely right, that smaller parties would likely become better represented, such as the Greens in Canada, because they'd get a more proportional share of seats depending on how that works through. How does it affect the members? Well, this is a complicated question. For example, if you went towards a proportional system, you have to think about how do members get selected for that district. And often there, it can be much more somebody who's being placed into that position by the party leadership. So the members are actually more accountable to the leadership sometimes under a proportional system, for example in Italy, where you'll get handpicked into that ranked position. And so we need to think about technical issues. If you're going to have a district which is PR, is it open or is it closed? Meaning, are the ranked positions selected by the parties and fixed, or can voters change them and individual members try to expand their share of the vote as well?
Thank you very much. Monsieur Deltel.
Yes. Mr. Deltel, thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome to our Canadian Parliament. First of all, I'd like to speak with Mr. Axworthy. You mentioned earlier that it takes a consensus. It requires one here within the committee to move forward. But in your opinion, if ever this were to be the case, should this consensus be taken into account? Should it be mandatory? In other words, would the government be bound by the committee's work?
consensus in committee is not unanimity necessarily, but it is a broad set of understandings. And my view is that if the government did not have consensus, again, repeat, not unanimity, but a broad sense of consensus from most of the members of this committee, I would not proceed until I had that kind of consensus. That when one introduces a new system, however good it is, the nature of its introduction will be crucial to its success. And so a system that was perceived to be forced or rammed down the throats of people would be one which would be behind the 8 ball before it even began. So if this committee did not have a consensus, I would keep working at the issue and wait. I repeat, our system doesn't operate badly now, so we could afford to wait till we got it right.
But if this committee, we have consensus, do you think the government shall respect this consensus and go on with the consensus?
Yes, I do.
You know that the actual minister said no? She is not linked with that?
Well, I'm not the minister. I'm not her advisor. I just
it's not
want
your Trudeau. That's what you said.
I just want to repeat that in my previous experience, when you give a committee a big, crucial job, and it's an essential framework issue, as the Constitution was, and as the electoral system is, that looking for broad consensus, not unanimity, is something which should place very, very high in your value system.
But don't you think that the best way to achieve that is by a referendum? Let the people decide on this specific and so important and so precious issue.
I am with Professor Harrington in this regard, that parliaments make big decisions. Parliamentarians are trustees of the public interest. And in that trustee function, though we need education about this, I still think the beginning is that a parliament could make this kind of decision on its own as long as it respected consensus and process. And so could this be ramrodded through under time allocation and so on? I think that would destroy it at birth. But should this committee reach a consensus, can that be reflected by all parties or at least a significant numbers of members of parliament? If it was not an all-party consensus, yes, it could.
Vous reste à peu près une minute.
You have about a minute left. Mr. Axworthy, I follow your logic concerning the fact that Parliament takes big decisions, but in our opinion, this is a really fundamental issue. This is the most important element of our democracy here, because this way of proceeding decides who will govern us, establish the budget, deal with our defense. There's nothing more important than electoral process or the electoral system. So are you sure it shouldn't be put to a referendum?
Of the pillars of our electoral system, how one creates boundaries, the very franchise itself, increasing the franchise to women, young people under 18. In every single one of the cases, and I just referred to one or two, in my paper I think I list more than 20 of those kinds of changes. Every one of them was done by Parliament. And therefore, I think this one can be done too.
Thank you. Mr. Aldag.
Thank you. Today's been, and this afternoon's been an excellent session for me just to kind of reflect on where we're at with the committee, and we've had some wonderful testimony again. I really appreciated the questions that were put to us at the beginning, some of the critical things, questions we need to look at, and so I've been reflecting on that as I've been waiting for my turn at the microphone here. But I'm looking at, do we have this, like the question, why reform now, and do we have that a crisis in process or outcomes? And I've been reflecting, like this isn't the first time that we've talked about a need for reform in Canada. And, it was kind of news to me as I got into this committee that it's actually been talked about for about 100 years at various times. And to me, that's fascinating. So I think that it points that there are things, maybe we're not at the crisis mode that we saw in New Zealand where there were really skewed results and people were unhappy, but I've been reflecting, I've been out door knocking, and during the campaign I was out, and the number of people that said to me that they weren't voting just because they've lost really faith in the process, that their vote doesn't count. There's all of these issues. We're seeing declining voter numbers and lack of representation by certain groups and all sorts of things. It's like, well, is that the kind of crises point that we need to be at, or is that not good enough to be the catalyst for it? To me, I think that our government has heard that there are pressures facing us that should take us, down this path. And then there were, questions again about, the options, improving superior systems. And so, we've tweaked, we've seen changes made to the electoral system, first past the post. The question that I really will throw out to all three of you is, are we stuck with first past the post? Have we not reached a critical point in Canada, or is this the only system that will ever meet the needs as Canadians? And so, I've been reflecting as well. We've had we've seen referenda across provinces to look at electoral change, and they've all failed. And so, why do we fail? Why have we never moved past what we have? So the question, as I said, is first past the post the only solution for Canada? And maybe Dr. Norris, Professor Norris, if I start with you, and then we'll come back to our witnesses here.
So some of the problems which you mention are there in Western democracies. It's not really about either a majoritarian system or a PR. Crisis of confidence in parliaments and their role and their power is very much affected by globalization and the loss of sovereignty of countries, which means parliaments are not the institutions they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. So basically tinkering or changing the electoral system won't necessarily meet those objectives. Again, in New Zealand, they tested, for example, political efficacy before and after reform, and it didn't go up. Confidence in institutions didn't go up. On the other hand, there are some mechanical things, if you like, which we do know that if you reform the system, the rules of the game, you do have an impact. The number of women in Parliament is likely to go up under PR. Turnout is likely to go up under PR. And so there are specific things which can be achieved by changing the rules of the game. Other things, in fact, actually might make things worse rather than necessarily better. So it's really a question of, again, like we said at the beginning, what's the problem, the central problem that we want to address? It's not a crisis necessarily, but are there particular issues that you think Canadian politics are really a problem? In that case, what's the best rules that can actually match that particular problem? But there's no single best solution to all of the issues which are facing you, just as there aren't in other political systems or democracies either.
One of the advantages of first past the post, and one of the reasons why it is supported in the referendums in British Columbia, Ontario, and so on, and it's not to be discounted. It's simple. It's easy to understand. We're used to it, and simplicity in your electoral system is an important virtue, and we're talking about a world of confusion and many messages. Therefore, I go back to the point that several of us have made, which is that if we are to make changes, boy, the education mission, and this should be, as well as the points I've tried to make about Parliament as a complementary thrust to changing the nature of the electoral system, the education which has to go in on those issues is absolutely enormous. I think that when you see these suggested reforms failing in referendums, it's largely because of the difficulty of understanding alternative systems and the fact that we are used to an easily understood system, which, by the way, doesn't work badly.
Merci. On va débuter la deuxième ronde par Madame.
We'll begin the second round with Ms. Sahota, I think.
Off that message of simplicity, I had asked a question about it yesterday, and I think sometimes people scoff as well about saying, well, it's still simple, no matter what system you use. And we had heard from an Australian witness that they had ballots as long as a mile, and but yet it works there for some reason, and it's simple. Well, I had a gentleman in my town hall on Sunday get up, and somebody had asked me on Twitter whether it was hijacked by a certain party, and that's why the person was calling for simplicity. And it wasn't somebody hijacking or anything. It was simply a man who had come out of sheer interest because he knew nothing about the topic. And I would say it was a very small percentage of those people, but it was more people that were there for a certain purpose. So I was very appreciative of having this person there. They're fairly new to the country, I believe, probably in the last like 10, 15 years or so. And he said, well, maybe you guys know better up there on the panel. So you guys pick a system that you think is better suited for us, but just make sure we understand it and make sure it's simple, because I'm not sure why we're even messing with this. So I looked at him and I thought, that's interesting. There's quite a lot of people that don't realize why we're doing, around this committee table, we think we're doing very important work, and along, around my political colleagues, everyone understands that this is a very important issue, and maybe some groups that study it and are interested in this, but the general population is like, well, what are you talking about? When he was trying to get people out to the town hall, they're like, well, what do you mean? What's first past the post? I even had people who are in politics ask me what that was. And so I ask you, how highly do you value that? And having mentioned that we are a country that's accepting new immigrants to our shores day after day, do we not have a responsibility to also make sure that we're taking them into consideration? One of our fundamental key principles that we're looking at this committee is inclusivity. Inclusivity also means those people. Inclusivity means making sure people of all educational backgrounds can also understand how to go to the polls and how to vote and how to have access. What are your thoughts on that? And what system do you think could work in that regard?
I agree. I think simplicity, and I think the other aspect of that is accountability. Mm-hmm. When I vote, at the end of the night, I see who won. I think a system in which gets overly complicated raises suspicions that the computer is doing these things, and we have a government which is accountable because it has gathered the largest number of seats and the people have voted in a particular riding. And I think that's a value that ought not to be diminished as well. And so I think especially for new immigrants or people who don't pay attention to politics as a hobby or as a job, say, it's not only simple, but I can see the results and I feel connected. I'm not always happy with the results, but I know what they are.
Mm-hmm. Professor Norris, Nora, do you have any input?
So the quick response is, think about the UK right now, which has 6 electoral systems that it's working with quite happily. So you have first past the post for Westminster, you have a party list for Europe, you have the additional vote for Mayor of London, you have AMS in Scotland and Wales, and people know how to vote on these different systems. The complication is really not so much casting the ballot. That's some issue, but you can explain that. The complications are really more about, for the Electoral Commission and Elections Canada, how do you actually calculate the results at the end of the day? But nowadays with technology, of course, we can do that fairly straightforwardly. As we saw in Australia, you don't always get the vote result instantly. They took a bit of time, but they get there. So I think the issue of the complexity of the choices and the system is not a fundamental issue. If the UK can manage that, and also we often think that things are simple because we're familiar with them. But of course, if you change the system, people get experience, they know how to run it. You can also have mock elections before you've actually had the real election, so people can try it out and see how it works. So simplicity can be managed quite easily.
But Professor, I also wanted to ask, you had mentioned something about no system being able to eradicate strategic voting.
We only have about 15 seconds, but...
Can you elaborate on that? What kind of voting would you see in other systems? Because so far we've been seeing that may be eradication for NPR.
So strategic voting is all about the size of the party and your calculations for whether or not your core party, the one you really support, is going to win or not. And so you do that under every system. There's a marvellous book by Gary Cox about strategic voting. It's slightly more common under first past the post because any party that's in third and fourth place is going to get nowhere in terms of getting seats. But you can also have strategic voting if you're a small party in a multi-member district or in a very large district as well.
Thank you.
So it's all the calculation. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In directing my next set of questions to Professor Norris, to whom I directed my first set of questions, I mean no disrespect to the other witnesses who are actually particularly interesting. It's just that the subject matter is one in which Professor Norris, you're the expert. In responding to my question about comparing the two sets of New Zealand referenda, the flag versus the electoral reform system, you gave me an answer that was unexpected from my point of view. Those are the best answers, of course. You dwelt on the amount of time between the first and second referendum, and you emphasized the need in such a situation for adequate time for public education. In so doing, you reflected testimony we'd heard yesterday with regard to the Citizens' Assembly process followed by referendum in British Columbia and Ontario when they had dealt with electoral reform. One of the problems we face, and this is actually really critical to the Canadian context right now, is that the Prime Minister made a promise in the last election that we must have a new system in place by the 2019 election, and it takes some time to implement any change to the system. So, and my party, of course, has been pushing for a referendum, but questions of time are such that it would be literally impossible to have a two-stage referendum, even one that only has a couple of months between stage 1 and stage 2, and still get on with the process of changing the system in time to be in place for the 2019 election. So I'll just ask if there is a way out of that conundrum. Perhaps there is, perhaps there isn't. I'll just pose that question to you.
Yeah. I mean, deliberation takes time, especially as we've mentioned earlier, that people don't know about other systems. And so the best answer is really to have more flexibility, to abandon the deadline. That was an early promise that was made, I'd argue, somewhat without a lot of thought about what the consequences might be. And the committee is in some ways a little behind the curve in terms of setting things up and getting things going. And here we are in 2016, and we're still at the early stages of working out the alternatives. So my ideal would be to delay the 2019 and say that there has to be a proper process. This isn't the sort of thing that you can do fast to get it right, and you want to get the outcome right. These are also windows of opportunity. They open up now and then. You change the system, and they don't change necessarily in 10, 20 years. So you really want to, again, make sure that the decision is one which reflects the Canadian public and what people would like and what Parliament would like. So delay is better than to try and rush to an artificial deadline.
All right, thank you. The other thing I wanted to ask you is to turn now to another parallel, and this is the Australian referendum on the Republic in 1999. There was a process in 1997 and 98 in which a constitutional convention was elected and then met to decide whether or not Australia should become a republic. Under the Australian Constitution, a referendum is necessary, and the referendum necessarily is on the final product. That is not on the concept of whether there should be a change, but rather on the actual proposal, which I actually think is a really good idea. And the reason I think this is that while the Republic might have been something that was supported by the majority of Australians in principle, the specific model that the government produced ultimately was found to be unsatisfactory by a majority. And this is a version of the same problem we would face with a referendum on, or indeed any mechanism such as an election to approve a new model, is that the details of the model would ultimately be decided after the fact by partisan actors unless you actually have your approval mechanism on a specific piece of legislation that's pre-written, as was the case with the Australian model, and for that matter, as was the case with Britain's Reform Act in the 1830s. So any thoughts on that particular problem?
So you want to get rid of partisan interests to get this sort of consensus. For that reason, I might depart from my colleagues to say that an election which has to be on party grounds in the first place is a problem when you're dealing with constitutional issues where backbenchers might not necessarily go along with the leader or might have different views, and you simply don't want each party to take whatever's in its own narrow interests and propose that. That's essentially a question of chickens voting for Christmas, the classic issue. So if you can get rid of party, and that does mean a referendum which is open, where again people can, like in Brexit, support whichever side they want to support due to values, due to their own interests and their own philosophy about how the electoral system should work, then a referendum for me would be better than an election. But a referendum, again, for the reasons that we've mentioned, which has enough time for deliberation and which has other elements of a deliberative poll or a deliberative assembly or a constitutional debate outside of essentially the parliamentary constraints, I think helps to get a consensus that's genuine and the best sort of options actually decided.
Thanks very much. Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Boulris.
Merci, thank you. I will have to quote a study in English, so it's going to be easier to make my remarks and question in English. But first, Mr. Chairman, I would like to say that, we've heard a couple of times that we have to keep our electoral system simple because, for example, immigrants or new arrivants don't know a lot about our system. I would say that most of the time it's quite the opposite because they have to do their homeworks and they have to study it before they get the right to vote, instead of a lot of Canadians who don't study our electoral system in our schools. I have here, Madame Norris, a study from a British organization called the Electoral Reform Society, and making a little report on the 2016 Irish general election about the PR and the local link. And let me quote the beginning of a chapter. In Britain, it's a British organization, in Britain it is often the case that opponents of proportional representation cite the constituency link of the first past the post as a reason for support it. Having a constituency link is indeed important to the democratic culture of Britain, giving MPs an insight in the lives of ordinary citizens, allowing for the championship of local issues on the national stage and giving people a sense of connection to their MP. Yet, Ireland's political system demonstrates that PR and constituency link can go hand in hand. As Ireland has 40 constituencies of between 3 and 5 seats, it is still possible to fit local boundaries fairly well, covering a city or a county. We know also that in Germany, lists MPs are doing constituents work, are meeting with local organizations, and in other countries, the parties have quite an interest to have a diversity of lists candidates from every region and every major city for obvious reasons. So do you think that PR and local representation can go together like this study is saying?
They can go together, and what matters is the size of the district magnitude. So if you have a small district, Spain has 3 to 5, Ireland has 5, then essentially the individual voter can find in particular not just an MP, but a couple of MPs, perhaps from different parties, to represent their constituency concerns or to lobby for them or to do any other sort of service work. If you get a large district, however, that dilutes. So many countries will have districts of, say, 16 to 20, and there is no constituency service when you get to a very, very large constituency. And the classic cases are in Israel, where you have the whole country as one constituency, and in the Netherlands. In those countries, there's very weak links indeed between the members of the Knesset, for example, in Israel, and individual voters. At that stage, it's broken. So it really depends on how you draw your boundaries as to how you actually create an incentive to have constituency service. It's not about an either-or system of PR versus single members.
Some people in here are saying that maybe we should reach a Canadian system, which be maybe for really big ridings that are bigger than most of European countries. We still keep a first past the post system because it's like impossible to merge them. It will be like crazy. But in urban areas or suburbs, it's much more easier, and there is a community of interest that we can find there. So is it possible to have a mixed proportional representation that is mixed with some first past the post in certain areas?
So So we don't want to create a new cleavage between essentially the urban voters and the rural voters. That can create all sorts of problems where some have one set of representation and the other one have others. You can certainly think about the boundaries and be more imaginative about how you draw the boundaries around different districts, so that you can make sure that they're somewhat even across your different sizes of the current ridings that you've got. But I wouldn't recommend ideally having 2 or 3 different electoral systems for different areas of the country, because that would create all sorts of distortions in representation and many other complications for members as well, I think.
30 seconds.
On a dit auparavant, Madame, que
We said earlier that the proportional system could improve things for women. Would you also agree with the quota system? Or, as my colleague Kennedy Stewart talked about, financial penalties for parties that don't put forward enough female candidates?
PR normally generally increases the number of women automatically by the incentive we mentioned. Quota systems are also very good, although sometimes difficult to implement under first past the post, but they can be done. For example, in the UK they've been used. And then financial penalties to make sure that if you introduce any sort of positive or affirmative action, parties have an incentive to go along with it through, for example, incentives through campaign funding or party funding is also very good. Having it in the law but having an incentive with it strengthens the work that you do.
Thank you. Monsieur Sainte-Marie, vous avez la parole.
Oui. Mr. Sainte-Marie, you have the floor. So we have an electoral system that has its values, it has stability. There are some problems of distortion, however. So we're studying this in committee, and we've had the great good luck to hear from experts to see what systems could be the best with those values or others, and we're wondering about this. So, Mr. Axworthy and Mr. Harrington, you were talking about an important institution in Canada. You mentioned it several times during the exchanges, and that's the Senate. It has a role to play. Unfortunately, it's suffering from a problem of legitimacy, given that senators are not elected. Do you think it would be foreseeable and desirable in the reform of political institutions to have better representativity, to think of the reform of the Senate, the result of which would be that senators could be elected, I don't know, at least out at one time?
The 2 houses of Parliament have differing virtues, and partisanship is critical to our party system, and therefore it's the cockpit of the House of Commons, and of course it has democratic legitimacy. I've used David Smith's terms about the People's Parliament. The role of the Senate is more for deliberation, checking abuses, improving legislation, and I think, in my view, for the overall good, one should combine the virtues of each of those institutions, not replicate the good and the bad of the House of Commons in the Senate itself. And the Senate, as I said, had problems, obviously, and seriously ones, but the changing the nature of the appointment process with a nonpartisan, a merit-based, much more representative Senate, leading, which, by the way, these will be huge changes if, as they continue, and with, I hope, future prime ministers will now take this as a convention and not go back to just appointing partisans to the Senate. We are just working out the system. There will be huge changes as we have independent senators using their expertise on series of legislation and hopefully improving it and referring it back to the Commons. But therefore, our House of Commons has democratic legitimacy. Our Senate, through the new system, can have appointed policy legitimacy.
Monsieur Harrington?
I agree completely. I think that the Senate does not necessarily suffer from structural problems. The problems of the Senate can be solved by appointing better senators. And the fact that the Senate is not elected is a puzzling objection to me, since the Supreme Court itself is not elected, and we defer in a great many, I think, unhealthy ways to the Supreme Court. And so the fact that a body is or is not elected doesn't seem to mean that it doesn't play an important constitutional role. And I would agree completely with the idea that an election of senators would create a body in competition with the House. And if one wants to see the fruits of that, one merely has to look south and see the United States Senate used to have its members appointed by the legislatures of the states. It truly represented the regional interests of the states. And now we hear all the time about gridlock, and you can see that gridlock is rampant. In fact, there's a joke. I used to work in Washington, and the joke used to be the Senate is a place where good bills go to die. And it's because the Senate does not defer to the House. And I think.
J'aurais maintenant une question pour Madame Norris.
I now have a question for Professor Norris. As you know, we are 338 elected members, and we represent roughly 100,000 people each. If there was a reform to the electoral system, and we used a proportional system with lists, in your opinion, would it be better to increase the size of ridings and keep the number of elected officials as it is, or increase the number of MPs, as we're already 338?
You'd increase the number of MPs per district. So that means that the size of the ridings would have to be consolidated. So you might have, for example, a district that now would be, say, Montreal versus different parts or particular cities in Toronto. It could be that. So normally you'd have to have multi-member districts to have any sort of PR system, and that would be the easiest way to do that. But that would depend on the Boundary Commission and how they would think through what would be a natural constituency and what would be the conventions of drawing boundaries.
Thank you. We'll have to move on to our next questioner, Ms. May.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm drawn to the term that you've used, Professor Norris, of talking about fairness to smaller parties. Now, I will confess that I am leader of the Green Party of Canada, and I'm not actually interested in fairness to parties at all. I think our goal has to be what's in the best interests of voters and citizens, and in fairness to them, we're looking at changing our voting system. And again, I appreciate that it's about values, but how do you, in looking at your research, assess the role of parties in dictating voting systems and the fairness to the voters, which I think has to be our top concern?
Well, fairness to voters is normally understood by everybody as a share of the votes goes to a share of seats. And so any system which is majoritarian systematically penalises the parties who are in third, fourth and fifth place, and always gives a winner's bonus, an exaggerative bonus, to the party in first place, whoever that party is. So the majoritarian system is not designed to have fairness per se in that regard. At the heart of it, it's designed to produce a strong majority, to get decisive decisions with a strong executive. And that can be a fundamental problem, particularly because over the years, particularly since the 1950s, there's been a de-alignment progressively in nearly every country in the Western world, and a proliferation of many more parties, because people aren't necessarily seeing themselves in class terms as supporting the parties on the left and right. They have many other interests like the environment, also it has to be said, like populist parties on the right. And so party systems are fragmented, and first past the post, a majoritarian systems tries to squeeze what the voters actually want to do in terms of their party preferences into a system which doesn't allow that sort of representation. So that's really a very, very strong argument to say some sort of reform in Canada is very appropriate. Majoritarian systems work proportionally if you're a two-party system. If you're in the United States and you can only vote Democrat or Republican, by and large, the Libertarians and the Greens are going to get as most 5% of the vote, then you get a roughly proportional share of votes to seats. If you get 5 parties, if you get 10 parties, if you get 15 parties, as increasingly most countries are having, then even though they get a share of the votes, they don't get full representation, and so a large part of the population is not represented through the electoral system. So it's the classic argument in favour of some sort of reform. It It also will affect, on my projections, the NDP. It won't affect the Bloc Québécois so much because they're concentrated in particular areas, but the Greens, who are spread across different parts of Canada, will always lose out from the current Canadian system.
If I can turn to you, Professor Axworthy, this fundamental question of whether we're better off to have a strong majority government, and at some risk when smaller parties can exert their particular agenda. Because you were paying a lot of attention to politics at the time, I'm thinking about the minority parliament of Lester B. Pearson, where if it hadn't been for a strong, smaller party, the NDP and Tommy Douglas, we wouldn't have our health care system, we wouldn't have the Canada Pension Plan, we wouldn't have student loans, we wouldn't have unemployment insurance. All these things were created because of pressure from a smaller group of seats. Whereas in the false majority situation of our most recent parliament, we had policies that worked against any action on climate change, which was not something that was supported by the majority of Canadians, but was executed by, one might say, a smaller party in reality that exerted its influence 100% because of our voting system. I wonder if you see a risk. How do you tease out the differences between concern for effective government and a majority, and how much do we actually not have a risk but a benefit from having those other interests have a seat at the table as they did in the minority parliament of Lester Pearson?
Well, it depends how the executive responds to the minority parties. Are they, in fact, accommodative, or every party is competitive, or are they antagonistic? When I first came to Ottawa, which was in the Jurassic Age, my minister was Walter Gordon, then president of the Privy Council. Now, one of my first jobs from Mr. Gordon was to go listen to parliamentary debates to see who had good ideas, so the Liberals could steal them. I mean, that's what Liberals like to do, but that was indicative of an approach to Parliament to try to learn from it. And so, yes, the Pearson government was an enormously creative one, a little disorganized, but enormously creative. And that was because of the mindset in dealing with the accommodation among parties. We've lost a lot of that accommodation ethos as I've seen politics develop in the country.
Thank you. Thanks. That actually uses up that time exactly to the second. So, Mr. DeCourcy, it is your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're looking quite spry in that seat.
Give him a raise.
Hope you're getting a raise.
Depend on my time allocation. Dr. Axworthy, I would agree with you that Liberals have always endeavored to adopt good ideas and put them into practice. And but my question is more on the following up on my colleague, Mr. Saint-Marie, on the question of the size of Parliament, and should parliamentarians exert their ability to introduce change to the electoral system, what appetite would there be from Canadians to grow the size of Parliament in your view? What is a reasonable size of constituency for a member of Parliament, perhaps a member representing a local constituency? What's the reasonable number of electors for that person to be accountable to, and are there other considerations that we should be mindful of?
Well, we could have the Sergeant of Arms or the Speaker here or the Board of Internal Economy, but I'm not sure how much more space our House of Commons could take in terms of increased numbers, unless we get away from the Canadian tradition, which is that every member has a place in the House of Commons, a seat, and adopt the British system of not having that, of coming into a parliament when one can. I think that I'm not sure. Now, we have increased the numbers recently in the past few years. I think you get to a point, though, where the numbers become too large for people to come to grasp, and it's hard then to organize your very system. So my view would be perhaps that could be expanded more. I don't think radically more. A House of 600 in Canada, for example, Britain has roughly that with considerably more of our population. I think you do begin to hit limits. Just adding more members is not a solution. And you could tell me as a member of Parliament the rough size of a riding. Probably anything much beyond 100,000 gets very difficult to service.
Thank you. And Dr. Harrington, maybe flowing from that question, or size of ridings, other modalities that we have to consider with different systems, where should we be careful about moving towards Section 42 considerations as opposed to Section 44 considerations? What sort of aspects of potential change should we be mindful of, in your view?
Well, I would suggest that Parliament, or that Parliament have a great deal of leeway in the organization of ridings. I think thus far the court seems to be rather deferential to that, regards that as rather housekeeping issues. I think the problem that so ridings, I think the number of members of Parliament, I think the court seems to have made clear that it regards that as something left to Parliament itself to determine. I think the court's big problem is the composition, is the selection question. When you look both at the Senate reference and the Supreme Court reference, they're about how are the members chosen. And particularly, I think more instructive than the Senate reference is the Supreme Court reference, since as I've pointed out, the qualifications that we are discussing actually are after Confederation. So they're not, the qualifications that were before the court were those created in 1875. So they weren't in the Constitution. Parliament created these qualifications, and the court said, well, now you can't change them because they're so long entrenched. And that's the question that I have. So I think when you talk about expanding franchise, I think when you talk about ridings, and those kinds of things, I think that's within Parliament. I think once you start to talk about how do I get to be a member of Parliament, then I think it triggers a bit of scrutiny.
If I have any time at all, I would just like to ask Dr. Norris, there was no mention in your opening comments of STV as a potential option for us. You mentioned status quo, alternative vote, pure PR, or MMP. Was that intentional in any way? Because you've mentioned it since.
Very briefly, please.
I mean, there are 1,000 different, in fact, there's 193 electoral systems around the world. It all depends on the details. So STV is one, but I can give you a block vote. I can give you 10 other varieties of voting that we can use beyond STV. STV is a form of PR for me, basically. It's just with small constituencies and a particular way of voting.
Thank you. 193, you've just sort of discouraged us a little bit. Mr. Richards.
Thank you. Professor Norris, I've got some questions for you in this round. You had an opportunity earlier in response to another question that you received to briefly touch on. I think you kind of ran out of time, but briefly touch on. You were asked about strategic voting under our current system here in Canada, but it seemed to me that you were making the point that strategic voting is something that could happen and probably does happen under almost any type of electoral system. Would that be an accurate statement, and can you kind of give us a bit more elaboration on why that would be?
So strategic voting is voting, again, not with the party you really support, but voting because of the tactics of who you think is going to win in that constituency. So under any system where you have many, many parties in a single member district, people are going to look at the polls, they're going to look at the previous election results, and they're going to calculate, maybe I really prefer, for example, the Green Party, but the Labour Party is going to get in Britain, so I'm going to vote for that. You get exactly the same calculations under any of the other systems as well, but the strategic decisions are being made both by the voters about where their best support can be, and when you're in a large district, you might well think as a small party you get a better chance, so you can vote for them. But you also have strategic decisions being made by parties in terms of who's their best coalition partner, how can they best put forward a certain number of candidates in any district, how can they maximise their chances in the way that they compete across different areas of the country. So strategic voting per se goes on across all these different systems, and it's not normally seen as a fundamental problem. I'd argue. It's just a different way of expressing your preferences on the chances of who's going to get in at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned today, as have others on this panel and on our earlier panels, that there's really no perfect electoral system. There's no best electoral system. And you recently had a podcast on policy options where you were stated that there is no best electoral system. It depends on your problems, and it depends on your challenges, depends on your society, and it is the society's choice. And then you also went on to state that it is up to Canadians to say what are the issues and what are the challenges. And in regards to electoral reform, and I wonder if you could just expand a bit more on what you mean there by saying it's society's choice and then it's up to Canadians.
So different countries have got different problems which they're facing right now. The United States, the key issue is party polarization, where parties and politicians won't talk to each other, and there's all sorts of fundamental gridlocks, as we've mentioned, between the Senate and Congress and the presidency. And so those are the sorts of issues which are facing the United States, and they might want to think about a sort of electoral system, rules of the game, that might promote a more consensual system. By contrast, some other countries which have proportional representation are facing party fragmentation. They have too many parties, they can't ever get anything done, they can't get the executive to be stable, they have a continuous changeover of prime ministers or leaders or parties or governments, and so for them they need to think about moving more towards a majoritarian system. So it really depends on what the challenges are, and the way that I've always thought about it, I know you can't really see this, is as a matrix. In other words, you have certain challenges down the side. It might be, as the minister said, efficacy, diversity, simplicity, user-friendliness, local accountability, security, consensus government. Then you have certain types of rules, particular systems, that will strengthen or weaken each of these values. But unfortunately, not all of the, as it were, checks can be put into any one column, because different systems have different values underlying them and will give you different types of consequences.
Would it be possible to get a copy of the chart that you were just showing us? It would be great if you could get that to... we don't have high def here, so it's a little hard to read, but if you could get that to our clerk, we'd really appreciate it. Yes, go ahead, Mr.
Sure, thank you. And I guess one of the challenges we've had here in Canada is, the minister sort of had, you mentioned, I think, the 8 principles that were outlined, and then later on, just a few weeks later, there was 5 principles, and so there seems to be a moving target here, and that's one of our challenges, of course, but we do appreciate that you'll provide that. Now, you talk about challenges and each country having its own unique challenges and having to determine how it best meets those challenges. I would say one of the challenges that we face here in Canada is obviously, being such a large country that is so sparsely populated and with a great diversity amongst our different regions. So I wonder if you could maybe comment on the different electoral systems and how
I don't know
how they can help us, or what challenges they might present in terms of alternatives. What challenges they might present to us with that unique set of challenges that we face.
I don't think we'll have time to go through all the electoral systems.
Obviously, we're not going to go through 193, as was just mentioned, but I think if we could allow Ms. Norris
another 30 seconds
to touch on a couple of
to respond to Mr. Richards.
Obviously, mixed member proportional is one that's been talked about a lot. Proportional representation would be another one of interest. If you could touch on those.
Very briefly, please.
So for me, the issue here is really more about the federal solutions rather than the electoral solutions. And earlier, as we've said, there isn't one solution or one set of institutions that are appropriate for democracy or for the challenges of Canadian democracy. So one needs to think about a variety of reforms, and here one needs to think about federal solutions and federal powers and federal representation. Those might be more appropriate rather than think about the electoral system as the best solution for all of those issues as well.
Thank you very much. Ms. Romanato.
Okay, this almost seems like we lined this up because, Dr. Norris, I too have a grid and have been doing the exact same thing that you have been doing in terms of identifying what are those objectives that we have that we want to achieve and how we can achieve them, whether it be through an electoral voting change or federal solutions. So given that, for instance, in terms of encouraging voting and participation, we've heard from witnesses that, we can think of things such as mandatory voting, reducing the voting age, talking about civic, literacy, making it attractive for people to vote. That's not changing the voting system itself. In terms of accessibility and avoiding undue complexity, simple ballots. We've talked a bit about, maybe giving voting day off. Make it easy instead of people having to leave work and so on and trying to find the babysitter and so on and so forth. In terms of increasing women representation, trust me, it was not the voting system that made me decide to run for office. But, maybe quotas can be addressed. So given the fact that we know that it's not going to be one thing that's going to fix everything. And Dr. Axworthy, you talked about consequences of whatever it is that we decide to do. For instance, what are the complementary reforms that are going to be needed? If we decide to go with, for instance, an MMP system, and we end up increasing the number of people in the House, well, first of all, we don't have the space for 600. How is the committee work going to be done? Do those that are on a list do the committee work, and those that are elected in the riding have to do the constit work? That's going to change who decides to run for office in terms of recruiting people, because maybe someone wants to do both. So those are all the things that are going to be impacted by whatever it is that we decide to do. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that in terms of it's not going to be a one-stop shop in terms of an alternative voting system that will fix everything. And I'd like to get your comments. And I'll happily share my grade too.
Who would you like to respond?
Any one of you.
Well,
I think that
let's start with
the grid is the best. The grid is the best way to go, to think about this, that you're trying to achieve different things and that there's no consensus about what the problems are, and then think, what's the range of solutions that we can have for any of those? So just as you said for turnout, compulsory voting or mandatory voting is one solution. Changing the electoral system is another much more radical solution that can also affect turnout, but also convenience voting, getting everything to the voter rather than expecting the voter to come to the ballot station, and registration processes. There are many, many solutions around the world on all of these sorts of things. And I think one of the things, again, the committee is doing very well, but again can expand our knowledge of this, is to really take account of international perspectives, because there's all of these systems that work in different places. And bringing that international knowledge into Canada helps us to see the really practical solutions that could work in another country to solve those particular issues. There's never a single mechanical solution for all of those problems, but there are many, and we can learn from the best practices and sharing it across different countries.
You seem to look like you wanted to answer this question.
Well, I think that this committee has had the great advantage of going into depth in these issues, having people from different perspectives around the world. And one of the responsibilities that I would recommend to you as you do your work is then to do the kind of list, to think about possible changes that could occur without necessarily or complementary to the changes you recommend for the electoral system. It would be very useful to really think about implementation sets of issues around any new ideas that you come up with. And implementation on almost any public policy is the aspect which is never thought through. The press release is what's thought through, not the implementation. And so it is, I think, on these issues of democratic reform. So the examples were just given that there may be several easier ways to achieve a solution or to mitigate a bad impact, and comparatively and with the experts and the citizens you'll be all hearing from and your colleagues in the House, a compendium of those solid ideas to improve the system should go along on the implementation program of whatever you want to suggest. That would be very, very important and fairly rare in the policy world of Ottawa.
Thank you. Monsieur Dubé.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Norris, I would like to continue the discussion we had started earlier, talking about the lists and the choices made from the list, because often when we talk about proportional representation, those who are against it have the impression that there are three people in a dark room making the decision. But the reality, and you spoke to this earlier, and I'd like to hear you say a bit more about it, is that these nomination processes that our parties already have with different details, but still, I think they resemble each other quite a great deal. Or something like the primaries that we see in the United States to choose the candidates that will be on the list. Perhaps you could speak a little bit more about that, about the lists and how we could democratize the creation of these lists and ensure that it's not just three people who make the choice.
Right. So we get different types of traditions. So if you take, for example, Norway, the parties there have always been very democratic, very decentralized, with an organization where it's the local party that nominates, they nominate to the regional party, they then select and they go up towards the national party. So it's a grassroots democratic process which creates then each district's list and so on. In some other countries, particularly in some developing democracies, it's much more top-down, and the party elite, the leader, headquarters, and some other groups will personally, essentially, nominate the individuals who will support them. And for me, that's really a problem, because then you don't get internal party democracy, which you're trying to do, as well as having external democracy in the country as a whole. In addition to the recruitment process, which is often somewhat closed and a private matter for parties, you can actually also think about open and closed lists. So again, the closed lists, the party position, all that the voter does is vote for the party, and then they get the complete list, and it's not able to move candidates up or candidates down that list. With an open list, voters can express a preference for a particular candidate within a complete list as well. So it gives them a bit more choice at the ballot box. So all of these are details which we need to get right if we're going to reform, either for a mixed member system or for a pure PR system.
Mais c'est quand même intéressant parce que
It's really interesting because, as I said, making my comments, there are solutions that can really be similar to the way we proceed currently in Canada to select candidates. And staying on the subject of lists, and this is one we've already touched on as well, we talked about women and women's representation that is better in countries that have a proportional representation system. And I'd like to believe, and I'd like to know if you think so too, is that other forms of diversity, it might be the same things for, like young people.
The case. So what happens is that when you have a list system, there's a natural tendency to select a broad range reflecting society in general, because you don't want to exclude any group, because that's going to be to your electoral disadvantage as a party. So there's an incentive. But the second reason is also that if you're getting a quota system, it's much easier to implement that with a party list. Say you have 20 MPs, and you make sure that, say, 1 in 3 is a woman, and that's a law which applies to every single party, then that quota system works well with a party list system. It's much more problematic to implement quotas if you only have one district. You can certainly do that through internal party rules, which mean that the party themselves prioritise certain districts. For example, the Labour Party in Britain said that out of the 80 top marginal seats, there had to be half of them for women, half of them for men. But that can create more internal conflict within the party than simply having a party list that reflects whatever those interests are: rural, urban, working class, middle class, young, old, minorities in terms of immigrants or the populations for the majority. All of those things naturally kind of include a broader representation in the party list system.
How much time do I have? A brief question. 40 seconds? But the answer has to be part of that. That's true. So I'll perhaps end with you, Professor Axworthy. I'd just like to come back to what we discussed earlier, and it's one we discussed this morning as well. The tension between negotiations that are public and those that happen in camera, in caucus, for example. That's something that interests me a great deal.
Experience has been that negotiations in private basically are the way to get things done in the most efficient way. Not that public negotiations can't succeed, they can, but it's one of the complexities or anomalies of our system that cameras and public face becomes an aspect of of negotiation beyond the substance of the issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Monsieur Deltel, 5 minutes. Okay.
Yes, Mr. Deltel, 5 minutes. Thank you.
And don't be surprised, we'll talk about referendum. As a conservative, I do respect the fact that you have plain confidence in our system and the fact that you are attached with our system. I do respect that. But don't you think there is any issue that we can raise and solve by referendum?
Well, I think referenda are blunt instruments for making complex policy decisions. I think they are useful for giving Parliament a sense of where people are on a thing. So, in other words, it's hard for me to imagine what a referendum. I mean, obviously, one can't put a referendum to a large group of people about, here's a single transferable vote system, here's a multi-member system, here's the first. That's not the way a referendum could.
But I want to open the door wider than that. Not the specific issue of regulatory reform, but wider. Don't you think there is any issue in political life that should be solved by referendum?
Again, I think I would shy away from referenda, except in a situation in which one is looking for just a basic understanding of where people might be on a subject, but not with respect to the designing of policy. I think that really, but in this particular case, I am very much convinced that if we are not going to have this go in a 2019 election, then there ought to be a referendum. In other words, I look at a referendum as sort of second best to actually saying, here's our proposal, let's go to the country with an election on our proposal. If that's not what's happening, then yes, then I agree that the next best solution is a referendum. I do not suggest that Parliament just say, or the House just say, this is our proposal and we're going to do it without either a referendum or an intervening election.
Very interesting, and I recognize that the door is a little bit more open than expected. That's great. But, if we have an electoral referendum, I mean, the issue of the 2019 election will be on the electoral system. How can we sure that the people will vote 100% for that? I mean, there is so plenty issue in the general election. And you said that in 1988, the main issue was the free trade agreement. I do agree with you, but it should have been something else. In 2012, in the provincial election, the Prime Minister set the tone for the law and order. 3 days later, the tone was set by the other party, opposition party, my party, about the way of ethic issue. So you can be sure of the issue of the election. So why do you think that we could have the election on that specific issue in 2019?
Well, I think you're correct in suggesting that people vote for all kinds of reasons. But again, I mean, when I look at, say for example, the European Union referendum in Britain, we don't propose to the public the exact process. It is, do you want in or do you want out? And we leave Parliament to work that out over time. And so I'm suggesting that that's a second best solution to the traditional Westminster way. Referenda are new, really, relatively a new phenomenon. Relatively a new phenomenon.
Relatively, but I'm from Quebec, and you teach in Montreal.
Yeah. I'm talking over the course of 100 and 200 years. It's a relatively new phenomenon.
On that point of view, I do agree. I have just one few question because just to be sure, do you think that if a province wants to separate, they should call a referendum, or would it be a call of the government, or a call of the, by example, National Assembly?
Well, that would be a different that's an entirely different problem because we're not actually talking about, we're talking about something entirely different, which is the dissolution of the Confederation, or in partial dissolution of the Confederation. Yeah.
Much. I think we're pretty much up. Mr. Aldag, to finish off.
Thank you. It's always the toughest spot, the very last one of the the session. We talked a bit about understanding these processes, and in the case of a referendum, helping people understand. And I'd throw out to all three of you your thoughts on who you would see as being the one who would take the primary role for education of the public in this kind of situation. Are there obvious voices, leaders, or who do you leave it to actually start a public education campaign on something as riveting as electoral reform? Maybe Professor Norris, if I could start with you. Have you looked at this idea of education, public information, in other jurisdictions, and how is it done?
I mean, you obviously want to have a plurality of views, and so you don't want to have the authority, as it were, producing the information. But clearly, Elections Canada, in my view, with Mark Milleran, would be a really appropriate, impartial, independent body that could represent and give out information very effectively. But also, you'd want the electoral reform societies, and you'd want each party, because there shouldn't just be, in any deliberation, one perspective. You want many different voices, and the media should get engaged. And you might also think about some sort of audit process, a democratic audit of Canada as part of this as well, to encourage further discussion beyond the electoral reform issues.
Okay.
I would just add to that, again, on implementation issues around education. It's not only who would do it, but the amount of time that was necessary for it to be done. It's a huge educative process, and rushed processes are ones that don't get well understood. And therefore, the necessity, and that's why we have to look at the outcomes, you need a very long lead time to begin to thresh out these issues. And that's why I began by talking about a democratic audit or a citizens' jury process along with this committee's work. You need time, you need differing voices organized differently to get this complicated issue across.
Professor Harrington, do you have any?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay. Well, and along with this, Professor Norris, you'd mentioned, multiple parties, and so the question I have is, would you also foresee things like spending limits, the way that we have for elections, being brought into play, or do you make it a complete free-for-all, so whoever has the deepest pockets has the biggest voice? What kind of parameters would you need to put around having third parties involved?
So you would obviously want some sort of level playing field to make sure that there's a balance of views and no one side. And that's a complicated issue. We're getting better at regulating party funding on a fair basis with public funding. When it comes to allocating it for referendum, it is more complicated. But nevertheless, I think the same type of principles apply. If we've got a yay and a nay side, then it's fairly straightforward. If we've got more sides, then it's more complicated. But public funding is part of the civic education which we've been talking about and would be really useful to do.
Okay. How much?
About a minute.
About a minute. Maybe I'll move to something different, and it's just, I don't know if this is the appropriate time to do it, but in this morning's session, I had finished my second round of questioning, talking about referenda as well. And at that point, Mr. Reid had made a statement. I was going to wait for the blues to come out the record, but I just wanted to say that what I had heard said is that the Minister, the Prime Minister, and the Liberal Party have said that Canadians are too stupid to understand electoral reform. And I really took exception to that, and I just want to put on the record that I don't believe that, that is ever the case, and that we clearly have said that, Canadians need to be involved and be have a voice in this process.
Noted. Thank you. No more questions for the witnesses? Oh. Alors, je tiens à remercier.
I want to sincerely thank this afternoon's witnesses. It was extremely interesting. The discussion was very rich in detail and perspective. and it was a frank and open discussion. We have greatly benefited from that. Thank you, Professor Norris, for joining us via video conference. And Ms. Professor Axworthy and Professor Harrington, thank you for having been here in mid-August on this sunny afternoon.
Made a great contribution to our study. Thank you. Bye.